So now, thinking about how we actually apply resilience, as I mentioned, it's becoming an increasingly popular concept, and numerous cities, communities, even countries are focusing on resilience as a sort of major goal. Now, it is hard to say what exactly the difference between sustainability and resilience are, because ultimately it depends on how you define both of those concepts. However, I think there is a real distinction when we consider them as organizing principles or sort of overarching goals for how we, say, plan our cities. So if you would think about a sustainability approach, it's going to be largely based on achieving a sort of desired equilibrium over time. It's also about planning for a specifically desired future and thinking about how to achieve that desired future. It's about managing for that sustainable future, including through managing sustainable yields. It's about creating fail-safe systems. So things that, trying to figure out how to make and develop things that are not going to fail and that can persist over time. And it's also going to be about maximizing your eco-efficiency. So that's thinking about how to make systems as efficient and using as few resources as possible. So in contrast, a resilience approach accepts that systems are in a constant state of flux, and so there is no equilibrium. It suggests that you should, of course, plan for a future that you desire, but recognize that you probably need to expect that the unexpected is going to happen and that you have to be flexible because things change. It's also then about managing the adaptive cycle and thinking about system dynamics, and also designing systems that aren't just fail-safe, but actually are safe to fail, because we have these unexpected events that are likely to occur. You want to design systems that are going to fail gracefully. And finally, you want to really maximize adaptive capacity, which sometimes means adding in some additional capacity, redundancy into the systems, or some flexibility, even if that is slightly at odds with with extreme efficiency. So thinking about these organizing principles already does point to some potential characteristics of resilient systems. Many of these are derived from work that looks at ecosystems and tries to understand what characteristics lead to resilience, and then these can be applied and are now applied across a wide range of systems. For example, urban systems, infrastructure, etc. So when we think about common characteristics of resilient systems, one of these is diversity. So this suggests that it's not useful to actually rely on any single mode of operation solution, or thinking about more about governance or processes, not relying on a particular institution, with the idea being that if one fails, you still have other ones that you can rely on. There's more innovation, etc. Flexibility is another characteristic. As I mentioned already, this allows you to adapt to sort of inevitable changes and unexpected situations that arise. Redundancy, this is about having certain backup systems built in to your system so that if something fails, you have an alternative. This could relate to infrastructure. So for instance, if we're thinking about an electricity system, you want to make sure you have some spare capacity in the system. So say if one power plant goes offline, you have an alternative. This could also refer to institutions or specific agents. So if someone is no longer available, you want to have somebody else who can do that job and who can fill in for them. Modularity or decentralization is another concept that's often discussed with respect to resilience. And so this is the idea that perhaps if things are too centralized and concentrated, if that fails, then everything is compromised. Whereas if you have sort of smaller, more decentralized or modular units, it allows for more flexibility You can replace one without having to change the whole system or shut down the whole system, etc. And also thinking about type feedback. So an important aspect of resilience is about learning and adapting to situations as they change. So you want to understand what's happening, how that system is progressing through, say, an adaptive cycle. And therefore, you want to build in feedbacks into your system so that information is actually going to be fed back into decision making, and so that you can adjust your operations, say, as necessary. When I also mentioned the contrast between fail-safe and safe to fail. This is important when we think about resilience, because if we expect the unexpected, then we need to, again, as I mentioned, have systems that are going to fail gracefully. So here is an example of a dike system in a house. Obviously here, if it functions well as long as water remains below that level of the dike, but of course, if the water would get higher than they had initially expected or planned for, or if something fails in that dike, then the entire system would be compromised and fail. And that would be flipping into a very undesirable state, I would say, if it filled with water. An alternative option in a city here, this is a park in Copenhagen that is designed so that while normally it functions as a recreation, sporting location, if there's a lot of rain or flooding, it is actually designed to flood. And so this is safe to fail, because if the city has flooding that exceeds its normal stormwater systems, then they can allow this park here to flood. Another important concept when we think about resilience is the idea of adaptive management. So I already mentioned the importance of learning and having feedbacks. Well, adaptive management is really a organization strategy or an approach where you specifically identify in your own knowledge where you have sort of uncertainties, where you're not sure about something, and then you try to build in approaches and methods for actually testing and learning about some of those uncertainties or things you're unsure about as part of your normal management system. And so that basically, as you're going through and managing a system, you're also learning about the system and gathering information about it. It's essentially a learning by doing approach. And the idea of adaptive management has been used in a wide range of systems and by different institutions as well, including the federal government when they're thinking about conservation. Now, while it does seem that it's important to think about resilience and to plan for resilience, it's also important to recognize that there are always going to be trade-offs where enhancing resilience for one group or one system may end up reducing resilience for another. And to provide an example of this, I would take efforts to green cities or to build in green infrastructure. So here you can see the High Line in New York, or this is a waterway in the city of Manila. And now the challenge is that while, of course, improving greening and flood defense mechanisms here does have a number of resilience benefits, it also may negatively impact other groups. So in the case of Manila, in order to green this waterway, they had to relocate a number of informal settlements or residents, essentially, that were living along those waterways. And that meant that those residents were relocated, in many cases, far outside of the city, where they would have long commutes if they wanted to come back into their places of work in the city. In fact, prohibitively long commutes, and therefore they no longer had access to those economic opportunities in the city center, and therefore their resilience might have been reduced in order to improve, say, the flood resilience of the city as a whole. Alternatively, you could see instances in the development of the High Line in New York, which is a park on an old elevated railway track, which has been very popular, very attractive in many cases, but has also increased property values along the rail line or the High Line park and actually led to gentrification, which can, in some cases, negatively impact lower income residents who are living in that community. So what these examples point to is a need to sort of carefully consider resilience of for whom, by whom, of what to what, at what temporal scale and where, and as well as what the underlying motivations are, which is what I refer to as the 5 W's of resilience. And you really, when you're trying to develop a resilience strategy or plan, you need to think through these as well as try to consider what potential trade-offs might arise based on these decisions about these 5 W's, about resilience for whom, what, when, where, and why. So just to wrap up today's lecture, hopefully at this point you're better able to explain why resilience is important and increasingly popular, talk about the great acceleration, social ecological systems and complexity, how it relates to climate change and disasters. You should be able to define key resilience concepts, including complex adaptive systems, the adaptive cycle, panarchy, questions of equilibrium, social ecological systems, and adaptive management, and also discuss some of the opportunities and challenges for resilience planning, including common characteristics of resilient systems, but also issues of trade-offs and questions related to the 5 W's. Thank you very much. Bye.